Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Climate Voices podcast, a platform that shares and takes you to the front lines of the global fight against the climate crisis. I'm your host, Omesa Mokaya, bringing you to the deep dives into the greatest challenges posed by climate change, the most innovative solutions, and the unsung heroes and champions shaping our world's future through sharing their positive stories. Today, we are indeed honored to have a truly special guest joining us from the heart of Africa and boasting what I consider a great and impressive career in environmental policy and has had a finger on the pulse of the intersection between environmental conservation, climate change, and Africa's development. Our guest today is the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP's Climate Change Coordinator for Africa, Dr. Richard Munang. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mesa, for having me. It's a great pleasure to join your amazing podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great honor to host you. So, Dr. Munang, I know you've been at the forefront, of policy making and navigating the intricacies of climate adaptation, mitigation, and the all-important sustainable development, for one of the most diverse, vibrant, and yet vulnerable continents of our planet, my motherland, Africa. So, but could you briefly introduce yourself and take us through your journey into where you are now?
Yeah, thanks again. Actually, this discussion is actually very timely because we're in 2023 and the past few months and even days have seen the continent not only suffering from the shock and impacts of climate change, but with people losing their lives from Cyclone Freddy in Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar that caused loss of lives and destruction of property, to the droughts in the Horn of Africa, where over 20 million people have been affected, and to the floods in Rwanda and DRC that have costed the lives of 400 people plus millions that have been displaced, shows that we are living with these apocalyptic effects of climate change and something needs to be done. My names are Richard Munang, and I'm the UNEP Regional Climate Change Coordinator. And I've been in this space for 14 years today. And starting this career and embarking on climate change since 2009 have actually made me to understand firsthand as I engage with countries at policy level and even at the ground level, engaging the informal sector and young people to see firsthand what they go through and also what they can offer. And therefore, with what I've seen from a policy perspective to implementation and to what the informal sector, our mothers, our brothers and sisters are doing at a community level, one can confidently say that Africa is a vulnerable continent. And one of the key issues that Africa faces today is that the vulnerability of Africa, with Africa contributing just 3 to 4% of emission, but being the most vulnerable continent, is as a result of one word, socioeconomics. The vulnerability with socioeconomics comes from the perspective that the low level of socioeconomics makes the continent not able to recover when a disaster strikes as a result of climate change. When there is a flood, a mother cannot be able to move to another town because he or she cannot be able to afford money. When there is a drought, a mother cannot be able to afford food because she doesn't have alternatives. And therefore, diversification of opportunities to empower people to be able to cope and become resilient is actually one of the lacking issues. And when it comes to the policy perspective, Africa is excellent, and we need to give credit where it is due. It is the only continent in the world that have ratified 98% of NDC, which are nationally determined contributions, climate action plans that, as a result of the Paris Agreement in December 2015, countries were mandated to submit, ratify that Paris Agreement and develop this climate action plan. But now, as we're talking, 80% of African countries have revised this climate action plan, increased the ambition more than even developing countries, even developed countries. And that is opportunity that the continent can move in a low emission development pathway. But it also showcases that the continent of Africa and African countries and leaders do understand the inherent opportunities that climate action brings. But the mismatch is that those excellent policies do not match with the same weight and effort when it comes to implementation. And so the glaring gap becomes wider. And so what is needed now is actually how do we mobilize and galvanize the continent's strength, which is youth. And that's why within these 14 years, what I've argued and what I have shown and I will continue to do is that you can only argue from a position of strength, and Africa's strength is youth. They're energetic, they're passionate, they're entrepreneurial, and the changing climate, despite the fact that it's a challenge, also present an opportunity. And it's an opportunity for jobs. It's an opportunity for innovation. And those who innovate and can be able to drive that transformational progress are the young people. So engaging them as an asset, not from a position of weakness, but from a position of their strength to devise solutions and innovations, and actually see Africa turning this challenge of climate impact to climate opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very, in-depth, review of what you've been doing and what Africa can do. And I know Africa is a very diverse continent, first of all, to start from there in terms of its peoples and in terms of its ecosystems. And even from the term, from how governance structures are set for different countries, we find different policies, in terms of addressing the climate change are very unique. You have mentioned the nationally determined contributions. I know different countries have their own NDCs. Kenya, for example, had its revised NDCs from 30 to 32% by 2030. But, your work ranges from not just in one region in Africa, one country in Africa, but the entire region. So for over the 14 years that you've been working, what are some of the, opportunities you're seeing? From challenges, again, first of all, you start with the challenges, given the diversity of Africa and the different set of, governance structures for different countries, that we can galvanize as Africa to make sure that we move forward in terms of catching up with the rest of the world, in terms of addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, very important question. Omesa, the continent of Africa, of course, is diverse. Yes, of course, it has different climatic and agroecological zones, but there's one commonality, which is its vulnerability to the changing climate only differ in magnitudes. No country is immune in the continent. And because of that, what I have also learned over time is that Africa's challenges also have common solutions. That a drought in Togo or in Burkina Faso, with the application of a solution like Zai, which is an indigenous knowledge, can be applied into Ghana in Kenya. And that a solution in Kenya can actually, like conservation agriculture in Makweni, can be applied in Yaoundé, in Gandere, in Cameroon. So common problems, common solutions. And I think this is a starting point. The next aspect is that when you look across the entire African continent, it's a youthful continent, whether it is north, south, central, eastern part of the continent. It's a youthful continent. And that commonality means that despite the fact that there are different governance structures and different architectures of leadership, the commonalities to me are an advantage, because even if you look at the continent, the foundational premise of how Africa has been governed for till today is that those traditional structures still do exist. If you take, for example, governance structures, there are still kingdoms across Africa. In Buganda, we have the Buganda Kingdom in Uganda. In other places, we have kingdoms that still have those structures that can be leveraged to be able to reach the population and masses across different regions in the country and even the continent. Why I'm bringing this up front is to present an opportunity that is not tapped before I come to discuss the challenges, because under the changing climate, we must always see challenges as disguised opportunities. But the fact that there are opportunities in disguise that are not being tapped, every challenge then needs to be matched with that opportunity. And let me start with the challenge of governance. Climate governance in the continent today have a challenge of implementation. When you look at the 2016 Climate Act of Kenya, actually the most ambitious act, where the head of state actually chairs it, meaning that they have the national emblem and the national leadership. It's progress. When you look at the national action plan, national adaptation plans, and the climate action national adaptation plans that 21 African countries have put in place, when you look at the ratification of the Paris Agreement and also the revision of the Paris Agreement, it tells you that climate governance in the continent is solid, but the challenge is implementation. And so the argument should be, with all these laws in place, with apps and climate revisions and updated NDCs, brilliant. Now the discussion now needs to be, how do we operationalize this? And I think there are two aspects that need to be part of the mainstream. If you get into the market or to a shop to buy something, the first thing will be, regardless of where you are, does this thing have value for money? Is there value for money? If I was to buy this for $5, is it worth it? And that means that where you put your money, as they say where I come from in Cameroon, you put your money where your mouth will thank you. It therefore means that investors investing in implementing climate action, especially the NDCs, will and must have to see returns on investment. But Africa is lacking behind. And that's why Africa needs to drive NDC investment plans. In a continent today, over 72% of all the NDCs in all the countries, 72% of Africa NDCs do not have investment plans. That is a big challenge. Even the 28 that claim to have investment plans are not investment plans, they're just costed. But to implement food security, to implement climate smart agriculture, this is the amount Africa needs. It's not an investment plan. An investment plan is, if you were to drive solar power irrigation and drive uptake of solar dryers and drive uptake of agroforestry and drive uptake of e-mobility, what will be the enabling environment that is needed for these? What will be the opportunities that private sector can tap into, and what will be the returns of investment? That will have to be documented using practical empirical evidence. And at the same time, that's one dimension. The other dimension is what I call regulatory and policy reform. If it is, for example, solar power irrigation, can countries be able to waive taxes on importation of the parts that assemble solar power irrigation? That's a physical incentive. And we be able to ensure that at least, if it is land tenure, there are regulatory reforms that ensure that accessibility to land, especially for our mothers to be able to own land and invest in it, knowing that they own it, can then be able to happen so that land titles can easily be given. These are realistic, practical elements of developing an NDC investment plan. The second aspect is finance. Because I was speaking today, Africa needs over 1.6 trillion US dollars between now and 2030 to implement their NDCs to drive resilience of the continent. But unfortunately, between 2016 and 2021, the amount of money that has come to the continent is merely just about 5.5%, whereas the continent needs over 126 billion annually between now and 2030. The paradoxical part is that the resources, the meager resources that have come to the continent, only about 80 billion between 2016 and 2021. 80% of those resources are coming from international public sources, and only 14% from the private sector. That means we cannot depend only on public sources to be able to drive transformational climate action. We must incentivize private sector to be part and parcel of this. How do you do that? Enabling environment, NDC's investment plans, and at the same time developing what I call innovative blended finance tools, because we need sources of finance, not only from government, but from the private sector. But the last aspect that I really want to portray is one in which I'll keep coming back to it again, is that no matter the amount of money that comes to the continent, it is people that drive transformational solutions. Unless the young people who are not just the architect of driving solutions in the continent, but who are the asset and who are also the implementers that need to be tapped into, unless they're de-risked, you might not be able to move. And what does this de-risking entail? It's about training and capacitating them. It's about retooling their skills. It's about giving them the right tools. Also, not only from the perspective of what they need to do, but also changing the attitude to start seeing challenges as disguised opportunities. And that needs training, that needs awareness, needs giving them the right education that focuses in teaching them how to turn climate challenge into climate opportunity where enterprises are. Turning waste, simple waste, agricultural waste, household waste into biogas. You tap into not just a billion-plus industry in the continent, turning waste to fuel briquettes. You tap into over 20 billion US dollar market in the continent in replacing charcoal. I think until this becomes the mainstream, it will continue to be a big challenge.
Yeah, you've mentioned a lot of things there. I've picked things from policy, from finance, from local solutions to climate challenges in Africa. Referring back to what you said about how the governance structure is set in Kenya through the Climate Change Act of 2016, we know that implementation, you said implementation is a big challenge, especially in Kenya or in any other country in Africa. But how the structure is set is that climate change, for instance, is a devolved function of the national government, meaning implementation is done down at the county levels. So do you see, for example, different countries coming, downscaling that into the smaller units of implementation at the county levels, becoming, presenting an opportunity for implementation again. And when you talk about the aspect of finance, you say much of the financing that is given to addressing climate vulnerability in Africa comes from outside of Africa. So where are these opportunities? Because if we are talking about, African solutions for African problems, where are these funding opportunities, for example, in Africa, that we can tap into, to address the climate change crisis locally? For example, in Kenya, or in Cameroon, or in Nigeria, or in any other country.
Yeah, very important point. And I think that I will start to answer that from three perspectives. So the first is there's no absence of solutions and sources of finance that can be looked internally. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that the amount of money in terms of cash is about 1.6 trillion US dollars that Africa needs. That's one. Two is that we are focused more resources to drive transformational climate action on cash alone. People have not been put at the center, especially the young people, who can be able to be the engineers and drivers of solutions. And I think this podcast is an important opportunity to make the case that yes, we need resources, but where are the people? Are we capacitating and retooling the skills of the very people who are supposed to leverage the resources that are raised to then make impact? And I think once that starts to get and sink, we will have more resources because even the little that could be raised, we will start to see transformational shifts. If you throw money on people who do not have the know-how, there is no magic on earth that is going to address the problem that any country or any community face. The other aspect that you mentioned, I think, is very important. The devolution system of Kenya and other African countries like Nigeria, which is a federated state, is a federated nation, do have counties, and in Nigeria there are states and other countries where there is the devolving of power for environmental and climate action to happen at the county level. Excellent. If you take Kenya, Kenya is actually a leader. Many counties in Kenya have actually not only passed climate change laws within their county assembly, they've even gone ahead to create climate change fund. And that is an opportunity to then be able at county level to raise funds both internally and also externally within the country and externally internationally. That is excellent. My argument is a step in the right direction. But what about also ensuring that initiatives to retool youth skills through primary school, high school, and even universities and TVETs or vocational and technical education polytechnic, how about also focusing on that to start making sure that investment into those institutions that can then be able to help retool young people's skills, to then be able to understand what they can do and drive entrepreneurship as a compulsory subject for every young person in the country, so that when they're getting out of school there, they start to create businesses. When the little money that is leveraged, either from international financing or from local coffers, can then be used to support these young people to kickstart their enterprises or support those who have started the enterprises. The third aspect on this element is about raising funds internally, which I think is really something that I've been pushing very strongly. It doesn't gain a lot of attention like external finance, which is okay and understood and is appreciated, is that Africa will never have enough funds to drive transformational climate action. In 2009 in Copenhagen, the 100 billion US dollars that was promised till today is still a discussion. only 80 billion has been raised. And how much has come to the continent? About 20 billion, which is just about 5.5% of the needs of the continent yearly. But if you take 2009 to 2023, you are talking over a decade plus that the continent have only received 20 billion, 54 countries. And the unfortunate thing is that even this 20 billion has only gone to about 10 countries in the continent from the statistics that we have. It behoves us to say, until Africa starts looking internally, and I want to make this clear that Africa looking internally doesn't mean that international obligations should not be honored. But if your house is on fire, you will not wait for neighbors to come and put out the fire. You will start to play your part to put out that fire before neighbors come and support you. Does it mean that Africa should continue burning as international finance delay? Absolutely not. The citizens of the continent need a decent life. They need to be protected. They need to be built resilient. And therefore, African countries and governments must now start innovating to devise means in which they can use the little they have. Because the good news is that every year, African countries spend $3 billion, which is 20% on adaptation, 20% of the adaptation needs yearly. If they can spend that, it means that they're doing something. But the question is, can they start to use that $3 billion, devise risk sharing facility, which is very simple, develop instruments with central banks that can incentivize, actually, that can incentivize commercial banks and cooperatives and chamas and SACCOs to lend to those who are doing well in the climate space, low interest rate, and government can add more physical policy incentives like waiving taxes on those who are developing and fabricating solar dryers, on those who are turning waste to biogas, on those who are dealing in the climate space so that at least they can become implementers. This is the kind of new thinking that is needed. But back to your question on county levels, I actually believe that counties have done very well in Kenya, yeah. And I believe I'm seeing in other countries, Nigeria, states passing climate laws. But what I think needs to be done in addition to that excellent progress is now making climate change and climate action part of national development and county development by integrating this within the educational curriculum and making this part and parcel of budget making, which is what we push as the UN Environment Program called sustainable budgeting. What sustainable budgeting simply means is food prices are up today. We have energy crisis. What can be done is that any budget must be able to be climate proof. If it is agriculture, is it climate smart agriculture that will deliver it? And then a budget for agriculture must be able to be located to ensure that every aspect of nature-based solutions, climate smart agriculture approaches are the ones that will drive it. If it is on energy, which Kenya is a leader on energy with over 89% of its energy coming from clean sources, that then means that energy budget will then definitely have to focus more on clean solutions. And the same for infrastructure. Is it resilient? So sustainable budgeting is leveraging climate and environmental solutions to help drive socioeconomic opportunities. And doing that, we'll see countries implement their NDCs. We'll see countries address the sustainable development goal, as well as their visions. And in the case of Kenya, Vision 2030.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've mentioned a lot of things, and I want to try to differentiate between mitigation and adaptation, because for a long time we've seen a lot of efforts focused on mitigation, because if we're talking about Africa, much of what we need is actually adaptation, because Africa is a negligible emitter of the greenhouse gas emissions. So, and there's a term I learned from you, mitigation powering adaptation. So how do we ensure that there are these efforts, implementing mitigation as a complement to supporting adaptation, because we might actually put more focus on adaptation again and forget mitigation, which has been a major focus, in the rest of the world.
That is a very important point. And this brings me to this aspect of narrative. The narrative of climate change in the African continent has not actually helped the continent. And I say this with a heavy heart from the perspective that the continent of Africa is vulnerable. Fact, their emission is only 3 to 4%. And the vulnerability is as a result of low levels of socioeconomic. And therefore, because of low level of socioeconomic aspects, the continent needs to put money, people need to put money in their pockets and food on the table. And if you take the continent today, over 65% of the continent workforce is in the agricultural sector. At the same time, in the continent, over 620 million Africans are energy impoverished. But when you put everything together, you will notice that it is not possible to build resilience and ensure that mothers can put more money in more pocket when you lock them down only at production level. And when you don't add value to what you produce, that's where Africa has been behind, and Africa has been losing as a result of post-harvest losses over 48 billion US dollars. It therefore means we must be able to look at how we can leverage opportunity in the climate action space, regardless of whether Africa needs adaptation or not. And what we have done is that a mother produces using agroforestry, which is a nature-based solution, an ecosystem-based adaptation approach. And she produces her tomatoes or her vegetables as kumawiki, and it gets spoiled. It is just as good as her having produced anything. But when a simple mitigation technique like a solar dryer, which has proven to not only increase effectiveness over 30 times as compared to open sun drying, one mother can then be able to store that vegetable for over 6 months and can also within that time fetch a market. It avoids spoilage. It also avoids contamination, which is a health aspect, and the longevity of that also ensures that you can be able to sell and put more money in more pockets, and also preservation like solar power fridges to be able to store fish and also store vegetable. These are mitigation action, but they are being used to ensure and power adaptation solution. If that mother uses solar power irrigation to irrigate a farm in Turkana because of lack of rains and lack of water, he is irrigating the farm so that you can have produce and be able to feed the family. That solar power irrigation is a mitigation action, but she's not using it because she wants to lower emissions, but because she wants to build resilience. And that resilience is to ensure that you have food to be able to feed her family and even sell some. And so the narrative of climate change in Africa needs to be seen through the lens of socioeconomic empowerment, because the biggest empowerment is socioeconomic. When someone cannot put food on the table and more money in more pocket, the person is more vulnerable. And therefore, why I coined this mitigation powering adaptation should be the entry point for Africa is not that Africa is actually gearing towards reducing emissions because they have negligible emissions, but utilizing mitigation solutions to further drive its resilience and improve its socioeconomic status. That way, they will be more adaptable to the changing climate because their resilience will be strengthened. And more importantly, they will be in a very strong position to be able to drive transformational development.
Yeah, so when you talk about some of these locally led initiatives, like you made reference to the ZIPIT technology, which I think was developed somewhere in West Africa. Is it Ivory Coast?
Yeah, it's in Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually in the Sahel.
Yeah, and I've seen it, being applied in Kenya. But again, it brings me back to the point that you were saying, whose knowledge counts. These are some of the techniques that we haven't seen being adopted widely because this knowledge hasn't been able to be shared. I only saw about the application in Kenya because I mean, someone came from outside and did some bit of research about it and wrote an article about it, and everyone tried to consider it now something that they can apply. But this is something that people have been doing over a long period of time, and there are other things that people have been doing. You talk about, I know something that you're good at. Like you've been talking about since I knew you in 2015, ecosystem-based adaptation. For food security in Africa. That's the first conference actually where I met you at the UN in Nairobi.
Right.
Yeah. So there are some of the locally led initiatives, for example, using other, tree shrubs, which are really locally available, like Tithonia diversifolia and all that have, the capacity or the potential to address the challenges that we're facing. But we see huge multinational corporations, for instance, moving into the, food systems We talk about corporations like Monsanto, which are kind of now dominating the food systems, value chain, and somehow the efforts to switch to industrial farming have undermined ecological farming or ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions, as you might like to call them. So how do we, grapple between, because again, Africa is made of a great number of people, about over 60%, small-scale farmers. But now with the huge multinational corporations pushing them out of the, agriculture value chain, working through public-private partnerships with governments and passing policies or laws that favor them. So how, again, are we talking about addressing these challenges locally if the multinational corporations are working in cahoots with the government in undermining the efforts of over 65% of the African populace? So as someone who's worked across, implementing policy from the UN level and all other, sectors, and also working in cooperation with other locally led initiatives, how are we supposed to go about this?
Yeah, very important point. And I think that firstly, this knowledge that you're sharing out here and bringing people to discuss it is already part of awareness, because people need to know what they're up against. And I think in the African continent, that has not been articulated very clearly. And so this podcast pretty much that you are leading is part of the solution. And don't underestimate it, because knowledge is power. The second aspect is that nobody gives anybody anything. You seize it. Let me repeat that. Nobody gives anybody anything. You seize it. And in this space, which is very, very competitive, where Africa, as I started off by saying, is a vulnerable continent, but it presents more opportunities than any part of the world. If Africans don't see it, especially the youth, to seize it, others will seize it and occupy it for them. And therefore, what needs to be done is for the youth to understand that you cannot be able to grow and develop without actually having challenges to solve. Every developed nation in the world rebuilt, especially if you take America, they rebuilt after the Second World War. Europe rebuilt after the Second World War. And rebuilding is never a bad thing, because then you do it differently. I've argued that the vulnerability of the African continent is actually a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call for young people to know that they have to seize their space and occupy it. And seizing their space is not through complaining, but starting to do what is relevant to the people. The other point that I think is so important, Africa is an informal continent. Africa, over 80% of the entire African continent population is informal. Our mamambogas, our mothers and brothers are in communities, they're in villages. And that then means that solutions that are viable and accessible to them are not complicated solutions. They are solutions like Zai that we mentioned, that people in the Sahel used, because it doesn't rain there, digging small holes and interspersing them with organic matter when it rains has actually proven that when it captures rain, it can be able to produce yields over 500% as compared to other places. Why is that technology not used? Because Africans have not championed it. And I'll go back to what I said. Yep. Only you can be able to tell your story. And when you don't champion your story and defend and own it, then you will likely lose it, and then you have to embrace what is not yours. Why I'm saying this is that there's nothing wrong with solutions anywhere in the world that can be embraced if they're fit for purpose. But the argument should be, do Africa lack solutions, and have Africans champion what they have and it's not working? The answer is no. Africans are not championing that with the same energy that they would discuss about lack of finance, which is a legitimate discussion and request. But the issue is, why can we not leverage what works? The other aspect that I think, and I really on the young people, is to start leveraging these solutions and making a case around it to be funded and to be propelled and pushed forward. The other aspect that I mentioned, which is Africa being an informal continent, means that even if you were to bring all the technologies in the world, they're not going to fit into my mother's farm in a small village of Jinquin, because first of all, she will not be able to operate the machine. But she does use green solutions and nature-based solutions of organic manure, droppings from chicken and she gets bumper harvest. But her issue is not about production anymore. It's about value addition, which then means How do we start to engage and facilitate decentralization of simple solar dryers to communities, decentralized solar fridges to communities, which is where investments in value addition and expanding the value chain will create jobs for the young people, empower our mothers in communities, put more money in more pockets. Unless this is done, then we are into trouble. And the other aspect is about the health aspect. We're talking about One Health now. There is the emergence of what is called the antimicrobial resistance. The heavy application of fertilizers leaching into rivers is not only costing trouble from the perspective that people are getting sick, the heavy metals from wastewater that is used for cultivation in cities is causing illness, causing people to be able to depend on antibiotics. And because they take it so much, they become resistant to the very antibiotics, making illnesses that catch them not to disappear easily. And this is killing and is projected to be the worst killer in the next 30 years in the African continent. What does that tell us? Climate change solutions are health solutions. Organic fertilizer, a market worth billions, and it's actually growing at 5.9% rate. But how many African countries are investing in organic fertilizer where jobs can be created for the youth as environment is not only protected, but climate resilient development is built? The other aspect is biogas. And I've argued is when the just transition debate came up, the continent started talking about we need to explore and extract our gas. Fine and good. The question is, how many mothers in rural Kenya and rural Cameroon and rural Nigeria can be able to afford a cooking gas stove? But they have been using charcoal. To displace them from charcoal, you need to bring an alternative that can still serve that purpose. And that's where briquettes come in. So why don't we start with what can be easily accessible as we then bring the other aspect that can build on top? It's about electricity discussion. Or else we need to decentralize electricity to every village. Excellent, that must happen. But the question is, how will that mother be able to buy a light bulb if she cannot put food on the table and money in the pocket? Therefore means electricity and energy cannot just be about providing electricity. It needs to be what I call competitive energy, where it is about to add value, to power agro-industrialization in communities, helping mothers to be able to dry their vegetables, dry their tomatoes, powering solar fridges, powering solar systems to make sure that people can then be able to power cottage industries at that lower level and drive agro-industrialization. This needs a policy dimension, and this also needs a citizenry dimension to embrace these solutions and champion them. And so to your question of external infiltration of the continent with solutions that are not fit for purpose, the counter to that question is the continent actually looking at what they have and presenting it not just to the world, but to themselves that this is what we need and finding ways to expand that. That is how you occupy your space. If you don't occupy your space, it will be occupied for you by anyone.
Yeah, you talking of just energy transition, you made reference to Kenya, for example, whose uptake of renewable energy is like a very great percentage, about 89% renewable energy. And, you know, coming from that point, you might want to say just energy transition, what it means for Africa and what it means for the rest of the world is a different thing. Because, for example, if we're talking about Kenya, it's already, you know, almost fully transitioning. And we see all these opportunities for, you know, transitioning to clean energy across the planet. But Africa, as you know, over 600 million people are locked in energy poverty. And these people need access to clean energy for cooking, for heating, for cooling. And countries like Tanzania, for example, have huge, deposits of natural gas. Kenya has huge deposits, about, I think, 400 million tons of coal deposits in the eastern parts of Kenya. And when they're talking about, powering the continent and making sure these people are pulling themselves out of energy poverty, the first thing that comes into mind is looking at the, locally available resources, and what we have in the deposits is then, the fossil fuels, the technologies that we're trying to move away from. So if we're talking about just energy transition across the planet, which means a different, might actually have a different impact for example, in the global north compared to Africa. So how does Africa pull itself out of poverty if it's not going to exploit these resources? Because the rest of the world, as again, the arguments have been over time, is that they used this development pathway to attain the development that they're boasting of at the moment. But Africa hasn't had the opportunity to use that, but we need to, make sure people have energy. You've talked about, down at the community level, I think there's a name for that. It's like microgrid, like off-grid technology.
Yeah, mini-grids, off-grids and mini-grids.
And nanogrid technologies, making sure that people produce energy at the household level, for example. And if they have surplus, they can supply, for example, to their neighbors off the grid. So how is that possible for Africa? So what opportunities are presented in that for Africa? And what does just energy transition mean for Africa as compared to the rest of the world?
Actually, let me start from the perspective that you ended, what just transition actually means. Actually, it means one thing: justice. And what is justice in this case? It's about equity, equitable opportunities and access to what is needed, at the same time building socioeconomic resilience. It's about justice, it's about equity, and it's about socioeconomics. So 3 aspects within the context of Africa. That's the meaning. It therefore means a mother who is in a village in Ghana and haven't had food to eat because of a drought and doesn't have money in his or her pocket or food on the table cannot be discussing just energy transition when she's hungry. They said, if you tell a hungry child that you gave him or her food yesterday, that means nothing to that child. She's hungry. He needs food. He is hungry. He needs food. What does this mean? It means the socio-economic empowerment of Africa is number 1, but it must be number 1 from the perspective of how we leverage climate action to drive that socio-economic without adding to emissions. That is the starting point. And that goes to the other aspect of countries wanting to explore their gas. And my argument on this is this: I think we're going too fast, even for the right reasons, and forgetting the issues that Africa faces. Number 1, Africa is not facing an issue of emissions. Africa is facing an issue of vulnerability.
Yes.
Yeah. Number 2 is that the vulnerability is higher in those who are socioeconomically disabled because they lack alternatives. It then means unless you focus on addressing the socioeconomic low base issue, you cannot be able to lift them from the bottom of the pyramid and out of poverty. And when they're impoverished, they're more vulnerable and susceptible to the climate impact. The third, why I'm bringing this dimension is for our viewers, listeners, to understand this debate. The third aspect is, if Africa is an informal continent, over 80% of the population is in the informal sector, what is the best approach to empower them to have access to clean cooking? Because 920 million Africans are energy poor, they're energy impoverished. They use on clean cooking, they depend on charcoal and firewood. And this is not only lowering their socioeconomic status, but it's also lowering their health status. Over 700,000 Africans die every year because of indoor pollution. Why? Because they depend on charcoal. They committed no crime. It's because they lack alternatives. If this is the case, which alternative do you provide to prevent loss of lives? 700,000 Africans, these are not just a statistic, these are lives that have been lost, and at the same time, empower them to lift themselves out of poverty. You must look at what I call accessible solutions. And these accessible solutions, like I said before, if a mother cannot be able to afford a meal, where will she get money to buy a gas stove? Even if you provide her with gas at 0 VAT, you need to have money to buy. That then means we must look at ways in which we can empower communities to drive enterprises to put money in their pocket to be able to afford what they can afford. And to start off with that, there needs to be leveraging what they are already doing, making accessibility to financing using chamas and SACCOs and cooperatives that are accessible to these people so they can be able to afford the resources they have to create their businesses using what they already have. And as they get empowered, we can then into the other aspect. And the question will be, does it mean Africa should not explore their gas? The question is not about Africa exploring gas or not. The question is, what is the best easy approach to lift people from the bottom of the pyramid while at the same time building climate resilience and ensuring that Africa is not polluting its environment? And the answer is Africa should leverage what is accessible and immediate. It paves its way towards looking at what is the best means to move forward. Let me just say this for the record. Building one liquid petroleum gas costs 25 billion US dollars. And liquid petroleum plant, building one liquid petroleum plant costs 25 billion US dollars. That's just what build, and that liquid petroleum gas plant is not a finished product. There, you now need to build another plant now to refine it. You're talking now billions. That is the very amount of money that Africa needs to invest to make sure that the energy impoverished people can be lifted out of poverty. Does it make sense to use that money and incentivize enterprise opportunities for young people and the informal sector so that we lift them up? And as they start to grow and pay taxes, the government coffers can get more money and then invest in such to be able to extract gas, whereby the people that they want to address now have little money in their pockets to buy. That makes economic sense. So the debate that I think Africa is jumping to on just energy transition misses equity and socioeconomics. Yes, focuses on justice that they have not contributed to the problem, which is valid, but misses the starting point and who this should serve. And when the argument is not made in this simplistic way, we miss the logic and we miss the nitty-gritty, and then emotions come in. That are still legitimate, but then we lose the big picture and then get embroiled in this back and forth debate of should we leave our gas under the ground or should we explore? The question is, where will you take the money to build the gas plant? It will be loans. Who will pay the loans? The citizens. Will the job come from for the citizens to be able to be doing what they need to do to pay taxes? The jury is out.
Yeah, thank you so much for expanding on that. The reason why I asked that is because in the name of, trying to solve this energy crisis that we have in Kenya, the energy poverty, we have seen a lot of, and the crisis happening in, Russia and Ukraine, we have seen a lot of, countries in the global north rushing to Africa and trying to have, agreements in exploiting the natural resources that we have, the fossil fuels deposits that we have, not for the purposes of solving the energy poverty in Africa, but to export the energy back to their countries, which are solely, dependent on that, because there's again a crisis that has been cut off from Russia. That's why I asked about it. Again, talking of justice, you mentioned a critical point about justice and equity. So I like to, ask from your personal work or experience in Africa, how the concept of climate justice applies in your work in Africa, especially in terms of looking at the nations that have done the least, but are at the moment impacted the most by the impacts of climate change.
Yes, I think the issue of climate justice is that of those who have contributed to the problem to be able to support the countries that have contributed least. And I think the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is enshrined in the rule book, the Paris rule book, and of course, the principles of the convention, the UNFCCC. But that said, the point that I made earlier, which is that climate change is a moving target. As the discussions are going on, people are dying. So it's not like it's waiting that when we agree that Afghanistan will be supported tomorrow, then everything will stop. As the debate is going on, there are cyclones, there are floods, there are droughts, lives are lost. And as I always say, if you carry your own water, you will know what every drop means. When you lose a drop, only you will feel the pain because you know how hard it was to carry that water and what every drop means to you. Those who are feeling the pinch of this are not actually part of this debate. Our
Yes.
mothers in communities, they know really nothing about this, and they don't care to know because it's about livelihood and survival. What I think needs to be done is to apply justice from the perspective of engaging those communities and providing them with the little that is available. Engaging those communities and building on the knowledge that they have used to survive even without support. Because I can tell you that sometimes the noise overshadow the progress that is made even in communities where there is no support. In my country, Cameroon, where I come from, in my village, in Queen, where I grew up in the northwestern part of Cameroon, I saw it firsthand, crop failure in my mother's farm, and I've documented this in my book. But the point is, there were coping mechanisms in which you used to survive. Yes, the corn maize will fail, but there are also techniques you use to bury yams underneath the earth for almost 6 months that you go duck them and come and feed us. Are we trying to understand how she did it? Also build on that so that at least her knowledge can add to the debate? Seems not really an urgency at the moment, which means that those that are more vulnerable also have solutions seem to be abandoned in this debate. I believe the real justice will also be to understand their gaps, to fill those gaps, because to them it's about livelihood, survival, and at the same time they need food on the table and more money. So the justice perspective from a global aspect is Africa needs support. That is unequivocal, and that should happen. But when it comes down to the country and the continent, the vulnerable, the informal sector, our young people need support from the continent because without having them as the climate army, Africa will not be able to fight climate change from an enterprise and opportunity perspective.
Yeah.
And that's the real justice is, are we empowering when the youth not empower? We are losing an asset, and that is an injustice. When our mothers in communities are not given accessible opportunities to be able to access clean cook stoves, to be able to access clean fuel briquettes, to be able to access biogas, that is an injustice because then, as every day passes, they are losing hope. And the only antidote to despair is action. And that action is what can be able to quench the injustice and narrow the injustice gap that we see across the continent.
Yeah, you've talked about whose knowledge counts, and you've said Africa needs support in terms of addressing the climate challenges. And that brings me to a concept that I always refer to, co-production of knowledge and co-creation of solutions, because we can't do it on our own. No one can do it on their own. Apparently everyone needs, some support from somewhere. For instance, to address the impacts that we're facing. We talk about Global South, we talk about, for example, the small highland developing nations. We talk about communities that are affected by, for example, the hurricanes that you mentioned in the Southern African parts, because their resilience again is impacted because we don't have the resources or the capacity to enhance their resilience. And you mentioned about the socioeconomic. So I wanna ask if there is a way the UN is partnering with communities or working with communities, for instance, in co-creating some of the solutions that you've been mentioning, or co-producing the knowledge you mentioned sometimes back. The reason why this knowledge is not spread wide is because it depends on who produces that knowledge. So how is the UN, for example, in Africa through your work, working with governments in Africa or communities in Africa to ensure that this knowledge of the best practices that we're talking about are scaled up in other parts that haven't gotten an opportunity to adopt some of the ones that you've mentioned? For example, the IP technology. Yep.
Yeah, very important question, Omesa, and thank you for that. The point is that the UN is a stakeholder and an actor in a space that needs everyone on board. We need a full of society approach. Young people, governments, NGOs, civil society, international organizations, including the UN, and even individual citizens in the space of climate change to be able to make a difference. But when it comes to the UN, especially the UN Environment Program, the role of the UN Environment Program is, first of all, to convene. Second is to create the knowledge and the science that can then be able to inform policy. And third is to inspire action. And when you start with the one of convening, the UN has brought the entire world in collaboration with the World Meteorological Organization. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created. And these have been providing sound science. Every assessment has shown the agency that needs to be taken to actually put in place not only actions, but mobilize the resources that are needed to slow the fast pace at which we are moving towards 1.5 degree. But the UN environment have championed science through the production of the emissions gap report that shows the state of emissions in the world and what countries are doing and what we need to do to be able to limit dangerous climate change. And these for over 10 years have been not just the antenna that alerts the world of where we are and what we need to do, but have influenced negotiations that have seen progress in these negotiations culminating in different agreements, from the Paris Agreement to the outcomes that we're seeing now on loss and damage. And more importantly, on top of the emissions gap report, there is the adaptation gap report that actually the one of 2022 showed very clearly that developing countries need 5 to 6 times the funding that can be able to build their resilience. And most of these developing countries are in the African continent. But more importantly, that the gap between finance and action is widening. And whereas the implementation of policies and the national adaptation plans, most countries are having policies, they're putting this, but the implementation is where there is a mismatch. And recently, 2 days ago, the United Nations Environment Program produced a report called Turning Off the Tap, which is about plastics. And it's showing that between now and 2040, if actions were to be taken both by government and non-state actors, 80% of plastic could be taken out of the environment. And that will take reducing the usage of plastic that can be able to save 30%, actually recycling that can save 20%, and also diversifying and reorienting. And this will then be able to create over 1.2 trillion US dollars, save 1.2 trillion US dollars, and create over 700,000 jobs. What am I talking about plastic here? The production of plastic results into emissions. And globally, plastic production results in emissions between 3 to 4%. That is exactly the amount of emissions that Africa emits. So if plastic were a country, were a continent, it would be equivalent to the emissions of Africa. And more importantly, in addition to the fact that plastics are littered into the environment and they clog up drainage systems, and with the changing climate resulting in torrential rainfalls and resulting to flooding that are not only plunging people into suffering and submerging their farms and homes, it means that when we reduce plastic in the environment, we are also creating an opportunity to ensure that at least the flooding is reduced. And the last aspect is that when people get sick as a result of flooding, either it is sickness coming as a result of diseases that come because of water standing somewhere and mosquitoes getting into it, or cholera that they drink the water because it gets into the streams in which they drink, that further impoverish them, lowering their socioeconomic ability to be able to build resilience. So the linkage between pollution, plastics, and climate, why I'm bringing this up is to show at the knowledge front and science, UNEP has championed this, and currently as we speak, during the United Nations Environment Assembly called UNEA 5.2, last year there was the adoption of a resolution to create a legally binding international agreement on plastic. And that will actually come into force in 2024. So the convening space of bringing member states to make decisions and drive legally binding systems, UNEP does that. Now let's come now to how does it inspire action? With all the science, what UNEP have been doing in helping member states is actually to inspire action. And inspiring action, firstly, helping countries to turn their nationally determined contribution, their climate action plan, into investment plans. Last week, we're in Uganda working with the government to put in place a national adaptation, national determined contribution investment plan, and also how to develop an NDC investment plan with a blended finance facility. These examples of bringing knowledge and expertise and working with government and state actors, producing tools will then be shared across the continent, leveraging on the networks that UNEP have built, and also leveraging the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, which UNEP is secretariat. But more importantly, the showcase of action. UNEP have actually been leveraging the space to convene young people. And what we have done more effectively is getting to the informal sector and inspiring youth and driving a tool called innovative volunteerism, which is very simple.
Yeah.
How do you inspire young people to see themselves as solution providers and at the same time become inspired in the environmental climate solutions and start to learn new skills as we provide technical backstopping? And that I've seen not only youth venturing into turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes, we've seen youth being guided to develop, fabricate solar dryers that communities today are using. The data coming out of that, what we are doing is we're leveraging this data and informing governments to put in place enabling policies like tax breaks, enabling policies like fiscal incentives to reduce taxes and give lower interest rates so that youth can be able to access opportunities. And the last part is how to integrate these opportunities into school curriculum. We're working with the Nasarawa State University, where the first ever climate action entrepreneurship curriculum has been created in the world. Is Nasarawa State University and Bayesago University in Botswana. UNEP has driven this, working with state and non-state actors, bringing a new thinking, showcasing solutions that are relatable to the common Wananchi and the informal sector and youth. And that data will continuously be used to champion and integrate into different UN portfolios through the United Nations country teams and leveraging and providing data to state and non-state actors so that at least they can see practically how climate opportunity is seized from climate challenges.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was actually going to ask if you have something to say to the youth, but you already started mentioning it. It's like you went ahead of my thoughts. You mentioned something about innovative volunteerism. Again, this is something that I've been following up on what you're doing on social media. And actually, through what you are doing, you're sharing through your platforms. It's something that the youth needs. Again, if you're talking about disseminating the knowledge. And part of what I'm doing with the podcast is actually trying to break down the complicated jargon so that we have everyone understanding, especially the people at the grassroots who don't understand the complicated climate science that we talk at the scientific level. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. So are there some other, I mean, you have mentioned that partly, but are there some other ways as we come to the end of this? We could stay here and have the conversation for as long as we could.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the interest of time, are there other, ways that you see? You mentioned in the beginning that Africa is a youthful population, over, I think over 65 or 70% youth. So are there opportunities because they're the ones actually going to be living longer to see the impact? So are there other ways that you see young people being involved in this space?
Absolutely. The core of Africa's transformation in new fronts, whether economic, social, environmental, and take the center stage in not only climate opportunity, but in an authority in solutions to the world, will need young people. I started off by saying that they are the most passionate, the most energetic, the most entrepreneurial youth that I've ever seen in the world. And one of the things that I would like to say is that when you don't face a challenge, there's no urgency for a solution.
Yeah.
And when there's no urgency for a solution, you become complacent and you get forgotten. Those who make a difference are those who are confronted with adversity. And it's true for personal life, it's true for regions, it's true for countries. The most resilient people in the world are those who have gone through adversity. They face adversity. And why I'm bringing this message is to the young people that Africa's adversity is an opportunity for Africans and especially the young people to build resilience. Africa's adversity should not make us to faint. It should actually awaken us to work harder to find alternative solutions because Africa's solutions are global solutions.
Yes.
Unless we accept and understand that this is how things have always happened in the world, then we fail. But why I'm bringing up this point is that social media studies and surveys have shown that Africa, especially the youth, are the ones who spend more time on social media, almost 4 hours at minimum a day, for those who have access to it. And what do they do? That 4 hours spending is not necessarily learning anything new.
Yeah.
It's about conversations and abuses and churning out and sharing information that it's not helpful in the solution space, but adds very little value. It's about role models that are by the word role model, but there is really nothing a role model about that. In that we are supposed to use these spaces to share solutions. Because if there is social media today, it means that a youth in Togo who is yearning for solutions can be able to engage with the youth in Kenya, not necessarily having to fly through to Kenya. And that space should be used to foster collaboration, to foster partnerships, to share knowledge, to bring new knowledge. And that way, Africa will transform through youth initiatives, not necessarily through any other. Government role is not to implement. It is to put enabling environment. But government follow mostly what has worked. When you showcase what you've done with force government and the youth today, because they are the biggest population in the continent, also have a powerful tool, which is electing leaders. And let's not get to the politics of whether A, B, C, D. No. They can be able to decide the future Africa wants and Africa needs by playing their role in solutions and at the same time also correcting the governance systems in the continent. Therefore, saying this to say that it stands and breaks in the hands of the youth. Therefore, for them to wait that things will be given to them, they will not. And what I'm talking here is not about using any orthodoxy means. I'm talking about solutions. Solutions are what change the world. Let them do what they can do, present the gaps, and force governments to close it with incentives. And if they don't close it, let them use the ballot box to kick them out. It therefore means if anybody asks me, governments are not doing enough, what can you say? I will say, no, the youth are not doing enough.
Yeah.
And when you tell me that, no, the youth are disenfranchised and they are angry against the government, but I said that they're giving those governments the opportunity because they're supposed to be showcasing the solutions in which they have undertaken or they are to undertake and force government to close the gaps through incentives, through enabling policies, through reduction in taking away value-added taxes and fight to get that. Because as I started by saying, nobody gives anybody anything.
Yeah, you have to seize it.
And the youth of Africa should seize this climate opportunity because it will not be given to them.
That's powerful. So I see opportunities, a lot of opportunities for young people who are listening to this. Seize the space. Nobody's gonna give it to you on a silver platter. You have to seize it. You have to seize your space. You have to find your space. You have to demand for your space to be on the table. Otherwise, the future is gonna be doomed for us, and we don't want to spread that message of doom. We are the young generations, and we're the future of Africa. We have to keep doing it. Yeah. So, I mean, we're coming to the end of this. Any last, parting shot for any listeners, whether young, old, or any person who might be listening to this? I mean, you have a large audience across the planet, and so there are a lot of people who have been listening to this and will be listening to this. So, what's last message that we want to give them as we come to the end of this?
Thanks again, Omesa. I think the point that I've made is if anyone is living now, he or she is the most privileged to have ever existed. The opportunities are enormous. So are also challenges in those opportunities. But if we focus on the 0.1%, we will lose at the 99.99%. And that seems to be what is happening. We must then be able to reorient our minds and shift our mindset to seeing the 99% and tapping it more forcefully to displace the 0.1%. Why do I say so? The complaining and batching of what is not working in Africa and projecting it on mainstream media is hiding opportunities for young people, and others are seizing those opportunities and occupying space that in 5 years' time they will never have that space, even though they're African citizens. That's one. The second aspect is that your biggest ability is your availability. Your biggest ability is your availability. Avail yourself and learn. Listen to podcasts like this. Read, understand. Do not just swallow information. You need to be able to look at what is right and what is not right and distinguish it. When you consume everything, you will be liable to use wrong information that will not be able to help you see opportunities. Avail yourself to learn, read. The third aspect is that your biggest premium on this earth is not the house you live, it's not your father's car, it's not the degrees you have, it's your skill. Your skill is your biggest premium, because with the skill, you have value and you can exchange value for money. With that, retooling your skill and climate change space present a lot of opportunities, and those opportunities can only be tapped when you have retooled your skill. Learn. It's not about what you study. Develop interest in the climate space and pick something, whether it is in fabricating solar dryer, whether it is in understanding the critical aspect that Africa is discussing today. And I'm not seeing the youth in that space, which is dangerous. The Russian-Ukraine crisis caused inflationary major pressures in countries. Hunger prices, flour, wheat prices increased. I have not seen single discussion from youth around how Africa can overcome this by using its Africa's goal, which is cassava. Cassava is an indigenous crop. It can grow during dry season and rainy season. And there is a research that shows that with a changing climate, the reduction in staples, cassava will be the least at 8%, wheat is at almost 45%, and maize. Without leveraging these indigenous crops and making them the norm and not the exception, we will still continue to externalize solutions and even externalizing our plates, our stomachs. That then means that we are just going to be living at the mercy of others, especially when climate change is showing that our staples are going to fail. And therefore, we must prioritize cassava, which is an indigenous climate resilient crop. The last aspect that I think is very important, I'd like to touch on this. Failure is not a crime. When you try and fail forward and learn, because if you don't fail, if you don't try, you will not fail. If you don't fail, you cannot learn. And if you cannot learn, you cannot change. And if you cannot change, you cannot be useful. So everybody who is where he is today was not born to be speaking about climate change like I'm doing. It's through learning, it's through making mistakes, it's through trying to find out what is the alternative. And as a result of that, you build value and authenticity. Know that you have to fail. But as you fail, have faith that at least tomorrow can be better. But tomorrow can only be better as a result of what you do today. But when we talk and postpone tomorrow to tomorrow, tomorrow never comes. But when we act today, tomorrow we'll see what we did today and we can build on that to a transformational change. That's how we can hope. Because I hear people talking about hope. You can hope when you are inactive. But when you are active, you can have faith that what you are doing can work. And with faith, you can hope that tomorrow can be better. So with that action that inspires and drives what we can be able to do, with a faith and strong belief, tomorrow will come when we have solutions in place. There can be no way to hope. Like I said, the only antidote to complaining, despair, and blame game is action. But action comes with pain. Action comes with pain. And if we are not ready to endure that short-term pain, we can never have long-term gain. And I urge our young people to know that with that short-term pain, there can be no long-term gain. And climate action needs us to endure that short-term pain so that we can enjoy long-term pain in the coming days and years.
Thank you so much. That's a very powerful closing, and I thank you so much and for your insights. I mean, it's been a very insightful conversation. and getting to learn from what you've been doing over the years. You mentioned you've been in this space for over 14 years and still going. Thank you so much. Some of us are looking up to what you've been doing. I mean, since I knew you in 2015. Thank you so much. And yeah, we like to close it up there. Until next time, this is the Climate Voices podcast, and I like to close with powerful words. I think it's from Barack Obama, if I'm not wrong. We are the first generation to actually experience the real impacts of climate change, and we are apparently the last that can act to end the impacts. So everyone, this is our space. Let's do it. Thank you so much. This is the this is the Climate Voices podcast, and I'm your host, Omesa Mokaya. Thank you.
Thank you very much.